Welcome to Stelligent's DevOps on AWS Radio.
Welcome to the 29th episode of DevOps on AWS Radio. I'm Scott Alexander, Senior DevOps Automation Engineer at Stelligent. Today's interview is with Paul Duvall. Paul is the founder of Stelligent and an AWS DevTools hero. His recent blog post looked back at 10 announcements from AWS Reinvent 2020 and their potential impact on DevOps and security automation. This look back was really important because it wasn't quick reads based on the time, but actually a deep look into these announcements and code examples showing how they can be used. Listen in with me. With me today on the podcast for the interview segment is Paul Duvall. He is the Stelligent company founder and also an AWS hero. Welcome to the program, Paul.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Something I noticed, you just released your top 10 announcements that came out of Reinvent. What's the reasoning to take that time in order to come up with the blog post?
I think there's some out there that will give you the hot takes right after Reinvent. It was a little bit different, right? Of course, this year it went over a period of 3 weeks or so, or maybe 4 weeks, depending on how you looked at it. I did release after the first 2 weeks a video on it where I was kind of working through some of the ideas based on the announcements I saw. And I announced 8 services and then I think 5 honorable mentions. What I decided to do instead of the hot take approach is really focus on the services and features around DevOps and DevSecOps, the ones that are going to help the community accelerate the speed of feedback between the end users and engineers, and also to dive a little bit more deeply into each of those. And so in each of the services and features I talk about, I talk about how to use it within the console. I give some examples in a number of cases where you can use a CloudFormation template. And in some cases, I talk about using the CLI as well. But to give people a little bit more of a deeper perspective on this, and also it's not all of the AWS announcements, right? There are 145 AWS announcements. And so this year I was able to really attend more sessions because it was virtual. And so I read a lot of blog posts and attended these sessions. From that, I came up with these 10 services and features that I think are really going to help the DevOps and DevSecOps on AWS community.
So for anybody who hasn't had the time to review your blog post and hasn't seen it yet, can you give a quick little rundown of what those 10 announcements were? And then afterwards, we'll dig into some of those announcements to talk about them in more detail.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just give a high-level overview and we'll get to it more deeply, as you mentioned. So I actually put it in order this year. Sometimes we've done the top 5. In this case, I did the top 10 of those 145 announcements. And so the first one I mentioned was AWS Audit Manager. And this allows you to continuously audit your AWS usage. And it helps assess your risk and compliance. And then AWS Proton, which provides automated management for container and serverless deployments. And then Amazon Devops Guru, which is a new service. It's machine learning powered that allows you to improve your application performance and availability. And then Amazon SageMaker Pipelines, which is part of SageMaker Studio, but it's a continuous delivery service for machine learning. And then there's AWS Fault Injection Simulator, which hasn't been released yet or even in preview, but this allows you to improve your resiliency and your performance through controlled chaos engineering. And then AWS CloudFormation modules allow you to create best practice templates in your CloudFormation templates that you can reuse. And Amazon Code Guru Security Detector is a new feature that allows you to incorporate security into your code reviews. And then Amazon ECS Deployment Circuit Breaker allows you to automatically roll back any unhealthy service deployments. And then AWS Network Firewall is a new service that allows you to deploy network security across multiple VPCs. And then the last one was a new feature, AWS Service Catalog App Registry. And this is a repository for finding your applications and in their associated resources. It's part of Service Catalog, but you don't actually have to use Service Catalog in order to use App Registry.
And it's hard separating out from 145 and trying to distill. These are really valuable across the board. And one of the challenges I found this year more so than in previous years where I was working for a company internally, now that I'm a consultant for Stelligent, I have to look a lot broader because I'm not just looking at what's good for my company today, it's what's going to be good for my clients long term. And so this lens of looking at, what is going to accelerate the feedback, what is going to make development more secure in their processes, I think it's a really good lens to look at everything through, because it again helps cut down on so much of the noise that we see in those announcements and find those valuable items. So I appreciate you taking the time to do, to put this list together. The Audit Manager, you've got a CloudFormation template in, as well as the circuit breaker, the network firewall. Proton, I believe, has it also. That's important. How much do you feel CloudFormation support reflects on the service that's being offered? Is CloudFormation support being available on day one an indication to you?
I think there's been a concerted effort this year to actually provide CloudFormation support for all the generally available services. So if you look at, Audit Manager, like you said, has CloudFormation support. Devops Guru does, SageMaker Pipelines. The Deployment Circuit Breaker has it, as a property of ECS service. Network Firewall has it, App Registry has it. So, pretty much all of them do. The ones that don't are in preview, like AWS Proton doesn't yet have CloudFormation support, but I expect it will. It does have CLI support. You have to manually install that. And then, of course, a fault injection simulator doesn't yet have it, and it hasn't been released yet at all. But I would expect, that definitely seems to be a trend. We often joke about going to Reinvent over the years and getting all excited only to realize that there's no CloudFormation support. We love to automate things. And of course, you can write a custom resource, but it's not going to stand the test of time. And ultimately, you just want to wait for the CloudFormation support. And so, I think AWS has made a concerted effort this time around to provide that support. To me, it changes everything.
And it also kind of being able to come afterwards. There's no way you could have had that level of detail if you'd pushed this out the day after the first part of Reinvent ended. That time helped a lot, allowed you the ability to put all these together, which for anyone who's wanting to take a look at the details in the CloudFormation template that are available, there'll be a link in the podcast notes that'll be directly to this blog post. We'll make sure that gets included so you can click right through and be able to see these snippets that are available that you could basically add to your CloudFormation stacks now and take advantage and start testing these features. So Audit Manager on the top of the list. That is really saying something. And I know compliance is hard. Audit Manager is there to help. How is it going to help anyone who's out there today be more compliant and be able to do these? Obviously it's audits. How does it help there?
This has been a challenge for, many years now. And if you go to, if you went to Reinforce, what was that, a couple of years ago now in Boston, there's a lot of talk around, governance and risk and compliance, and people mentioning how the current way that they were performing their audits was often with spreadsheet, and kind of more manual processes. And even with AWS, there's certain ways that you can ensure that you're in compliant. But in the end, I think it ultimately came down to a spreadsheet, regardless of what you were doing. You might have, say, automated compliance, maybe using config rules as an example. But when you needed to prove that you had certain compliance checks in place, you would have to route through CloudTrail. You'd point to how you're logging things in CloudWatch or whatever service you might be using. There was a lot to navigate. And now with AWS Audit Manager, I don't think it immediately changes the game, but I think over time, and that's the way AWS usually releases new features and services, is they want to get feedback, right? And because they're able to deploy as often as they do, they're able to get that feedback more often. People are actually able to use the service and they can then iterate on that and add new features. And so with Audit Manager, you're able to choose a framework. It comes built in with 29 different compliance frameworks. And so think things like PCI and HIPAA and other types of compliance regimes like that. And then you get to choose the different AWS services that are in scope for that audit. And so this is a regional level service. And so right now it supports 155 AWS services. So essentially close to all of them. And then it runs in the background for you and then generates evidence. And so they say it takes about 24 hours or so. You kind of check back after you initiate the audit. And then that evidence is provided to you essentially in S3 buckets. And that's one of the other themes I continue to see is around these managed services. And so every single service and feature I talk about is a managed service in one way or another. And so because it's now part of the AWS ecosystem, There's all sorts of things you can do with it. I think about the event-driven security. I talked about the example of config rules. Think about it. If you have a config rule, you're using maybe EventBridge, and then you want to, one, automatically detect when you're out of compliance. And so you can interface with something like Audit Manager. We're just starting to see what are the possibilities with this, but that's the whole idea is once you start to see this, and you can think about, well, what have we been doing? How can we work with this new service? And, so you have a detection mechanism with config rules, and you use EventBridge, and then you can have targets that you call on it to automatically remediate or notify you or give you recommendations on how to improve it, those types of things, and kind of pull some of that information out of Audit Manager. I think people will come up with some really interesting ideas out of the release of this new service.
And I think the other aspect that I noticed was continuously auditing, and that gets lost on a lot of people. You talked about a spreadsheet being our audit tool, and I absolutely have seen that. And I think my first PCI audit that we did when we were preparing for it, we just printed off the PCI documentation, and it's like, here's the entire PCI standard, printed it all off, sat around in a room, and just started writing on it where it was appropriate to try and answer this question of are we or are we not compliant? Mm-hmm. And the problem with both of those methods is they are a point in time, but they don't tell you what you are tomorrow, the next day, or that at some point you've fallen out of compliance until you run another audit. And so by moving to that continuousness and having this always looking at your environment, I think that's a big improvement in helping prevent changes where people don't realize they've fallen out of compliance. And so being able to bring those to somebody's attention that, hey, something changed. Here's the actual impact on something you're legally obligated to do. That's a major change. And then, of course, moving to getting that feedback to the developers to say, hey, this change that you made in your application or in your infrastructure has these ramifications, so that it's in the development environment, we detected it and we're able to prevent it from happening. And you start showing that over time.
It really shrinks the time. Yeah, exactly. Between when something runs out of compliance and when you then can actually remediate that and get it back into the system. Usually that's, like you said, I mean, it might be, at certain events, whether it's a release event or whether it's some external auditor come in, that might be once a year, once every 6 months, whatever. In this case, you can immediately know about it and then fix it as quickly as you know about it.
Yeah, huge change there. All right, let's continue on to the next one, which is Proton. Now, Proton is kind of curious to me because build systems tend to be very entrenched. And that's the challenge with them always, is once they're entrenched and everything's built around them, it becomes much more difficult to move away from them onto something better. So if you were talking with someone today and they were running, to throw out one of the most common ones, a Jenkins, and had it all built for all of their deployments, would you recommend they look to Proton for something for new work, new projects that are starting? Is it worth looking at it to actually move from Jenkins to Proton, or what's your thought on that level of commitment to Proton?
My usually gut reaction to these types of things would be try it out on something new first, and then based on that experience, you might end up changing things. But if you think about how Proton is, it's in preview, so that's another reason to definitely only try it out on a few services at first in your organization. But the idea is that it's something that Stelligent has done over the years, where we called them pipeline factories. And it was more than just the pipeline, it was more than just the application or service, it was the environment as well. The whole idea is like, especially in enterprises, and that's who this is really targeted for. You have what are often called platform teams or platform engineering or something like that, where you're trying to apply a standard that gets used by all or most of the teams that might choose to use it. But you want to be able to do that in a way so that it provides some flexibility as well, but then governance on top of that. And so the idea is that you can oftentimes with an approach like this, or in the case of AWS Proton, is that you have these templates. So you have an environment template, and then you have a service template. You could then instantiate your environment based on this template. You can instantiate your service based on an environment. Really, the orchestration around how do you apply an environment? How do you apply a service in a similar manner, with the idea that obviously all these environments and services are going to be different. How they get instantiated are going to be different. In a number of cases, we don't know everything about, and in some ways AWS is also learning. They're putting it out, getting feedback along the way. For example, if you, like you said, if you have Jenkins or, however you're defining your pipelines or whatever, my expectation would be that especially the ones that are commonly used are going to ultimately be supported. Under the hood, it's still running AWS services, but like you said, a number of organizations they'll have different tools. They're not using the CodeStar tools. They're not using CoPipeline, things like that. And so I would expect that once it's generally available or sometime after that, I would expect that it would be supporting a lot of the ones that people commonly use.
And I think that's one of the advantages you touched on. It's built on AWS tools. And because of that, the cost to try it out is really your time, which is the most expensive thing usually, and then just some AWS resources only for the duration that you're using them.
Right.
And so that opens the door to at least being able to try these things out and say, hey, how could this impact our pipelines? Or are there lessons we can take from trying this out and apply them to ours?
Yeah.
Or just say, hey, this is what's cool about it. And unfortunately, this doesn't work. So we watch the features to say, if this changes, we should come back and reconsider this tool.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Which a lot of people miss.
You were talking about experimenting with it. AWS Proton itself doesn't, there's no fee associated with that. It's, as you mentioned, it's the resources that you might create from Proton. And so it's interfacing with a lot of the CloudFormation, Service Catalog, Code Pipeline, a number of the AWS services. So you would pay for the use of any of those tools as you're experimenting with them. But I think it's a really good point, though, is that even if you don't end up using it, this pattern applies. I mean, we've seen it in enterprise. It becomes pretty necessary that you want to make sure that all your teams are, say, running a particular security check, as an example. And so with something like this, you would ensure that they're able to run such a thing in their pipeline, but at the same time, give them the flexibility to make any customization that they might need. And that's really the idea of this tool. And it can get confusing sometimes. And I point this out in the blog post. It's like, there's so many options around the deployment space, even just on AWS, not even counting the third-party tools. And that's another theme I hit on, separate to Proton as well. And that is this paradox of choice that you have with AWS, right? And I likened it to the paradox of choice you have on Amazon when you search for something and you get like 1,000 results and you think it's something simple that you want to get. I mentioned a garden rake, and you didn't realize how complex a decision you were making, right? But on AWS, it's a very similar mentality. The idea is that we're going to give developers all these different choices, and I think in some cases developers are saying, "I don't want all the choices. Like, that's great, you have those choices, but I just want to know how to do this particular thing." So I think it's going to be incumbent on AWS and I think companies like Stelligent and others to help companies really kind of navigate what are really good options, but all the options that they might have.
There was actually a great blog post digging into that issue by Corey Quinn about that challenge of all the different service proliferation and the choices that are becoming out there. And he likened it to Google, where they constantly are creating new things rather than improving what's already out there. But that is a challenge. I felt like my knowledge of AWS has shrunk the more they do. I can only focus into certain areas.
Right.
And I'm focusing on those areas that are going to impact the people I work with and the companies that I work for.
Right.
And so that always is definitely a challenge. Anytime something new comes out, is how does it replace what's already there? How does it change what's already there?
Yeah.
So I completely understand where you're going with that one.
Yeah. And I think, like, I don't know if there's any one person anymore. There used to be probably at some time. I don't think there's any one person, even at AWS, that really even understands each of the services that they've provided. Jeff Barr, maybe Andy Jassy, maybe, I don't know, maybe a few, but it's like you can probably count on one hand.
I definitely noticed it seems like Jeff still does a huge number of the service announcement blog posts, but there's more and more other people that are starting to do those announcements as well. So I even wonder if him in his position as the chief evangelist there, if he's even able to keep track of it all.
Right.
It may just be too much for one person. Divide and conquer.
Yep.
And that, definitely the case with Proton, where there are multitude of choices just within that space now, as you mentioned, within AWS that we have to choose from, not to mention all the other vendor options that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think they're solving a particular problem. I think it's a really good thing that they're going after, and it's going to be based on, how do they get that feedback, and then how do they use that to kind of further enhance that capability. But as we know, this is a common problem in organizations, and that's what they were noticing and seeing. So it's going to come down to how they execute on it ultimately.
Continuing down the list, the next one you mentioned was Devops Guru. And this kind of follows on the heel of last year's announcement of Code Guru. They also had some enhancements to Code Guru this year. Automated reasoning about how we're doing. Is this a tidal wave that's coming that's going to just change all of our monitoring? Has to be the question there when people see these. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I want to know. Monitoring is very hard to do, and it's very hard ahead of time to monitor the right things to ensure that when something goes wrong, you have the information you need.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Is automated reasoning and monitoring going to be able to help with that, in your view?
Yeah, so I think that the combination of automated reasoning and machine learning, I think, are going to be crucial to this. And it's interesting. It's kind of to go back to what I was just talking about when it comes to the paradox of choice. I think with tools like this are starting to, in some ways, address that challenge, right? Because in fact, I saw a blog post recently. I'm trying to remember who did it, but it was actually, I think it might have been Ian McKay. But anyway, they had listed all the different ways as of 2021, all the different ways that you can initiate logging for a particular AWS service. And so they went through every single AWS service ostensibly and mentioned, how do you enable logging for that? Right. And that's just logging. And so that's not, all the different ways you can, enable CloudWatch and metrics and alarms and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, the third-party tools that you can do for this. And so in many ways, we have the data. That's not so much the challenge. It's how do you reason about the data? How do you make sense of it? How do you truly, this observability, this concept, it's been perverted a little bit, right? Or not even a little bit, probably a lot. To really get true observability, you're going to have to, I think, use things like automated reasoning, using machine learning. So Devops Guru is starting to do that. So it's a new service, and it's looking at your application availability and the performance. And then what it does is over time, it's giving you not just the reactive, that's kind of what we're used to, is the reactive findings or the reactive insights, as they call it. They also provide proactive insights as well. And so they start to look at trends that are occurring with your applications as they're running in production. You can have it run anywhere, of course, but the idea is that while it's running in production, they start to notice certain things that are occurring based on memory utilization and CPU and all the different types of ways that it's going to determine whether or not your application is functioning, and then start to give you insights into this so you can then fix it and get it back into your code base and then release the software out to users. And so Code Guru is another one. In that case, it's looking specifically at the code changes, but it's also applying a machine learning to this. And so if you look at a lot of the services are sort of getting a machine learning injection, if you will, into them. And so I expect to see that continue.
I think back to my time I had a pure operations hat on my head, and the quote that comes to mind is generals are always fighting the last war, or some variant of that is the quote anyway that I've heard. And in operations, it feels a little bit the same way, which is whenever something happens, whenever something goes wrong, the immediate instinct is we add everything we can to monitor that, and we go to work on fixing that, and then add the monitoring in place to prevent, so if it goes wrong again, we know. And the problem is we're always dealing with the last outage, and then there's a totally different outage that we don't have the information on. Then we're scrambling again. And this monitor everything, log everything, and then let machine learning handle it. It's tempting for that reason, just to be able to have something else that's looking not for what we know, but what we don't, what we're not even looking for yet, just to try and give us that information.
That's a crucial point. The point being that in this case, Devops Guru has indicated that they're using all the data and knowledge that they learned from years of running tens of thousands of applications on Amazon. And so they've applied that knowledge to these machine learning models and then incorporated that into Devops Guru. So like you're saying, you're kind of fighting the last war type thing. In this case, you're getting the information, the data from all these different ways and all these different teams at Amazon and applying it to yours and getting these proactive insights to say, well, when we've seen something like this before, it usually means X. And so it's great to see.
And then continuing down the machine learning area, you followed that as an announcement with the Amazon SageMaker pipelines. Again, going to that hit on how do we automate the deployments? How do we make it easier for developers to get their work? And in this case, how do we make it easier for data scientists to get their work off their, desktop, laptop, whatever, and into production? And so we see, that happening now in the data science space.
Right. So yeah, with Amazon SageMaker pipelines, this is this continuous delivery service for machine learning. And this is something Stelligent's done for several customers. And the difference, of course, with SageMaker pipelines is now built into the service. But one of the ways that Stelligent has done this is using like code pipeline and other tools. And it's an interesting problem because, like you said, it's for the data scientists. It's also for the developers as well. And you're kind of putting the two together. So you have some code, and then you have some machine learning models. And how do you really train or build those models? How do you test them? How do you test the endpoints that get generated from that? And so I know one of the things that we were seeing was kind of a familiar pattern when it came to machine learning, when it came to, well, now how do we apply continuous delivery to machine learning? And so started to build up a similar type, there were similar steps involved in that process to building the model and training and testing and things like that. And so under the hood, they're using similar types of services. So it uses code pipeline. You can look at the code pipeline that gets generated. But the nice thing is it has CloudFormation support. You can run it from the CLI. You can run it from the SageMaker Studio. And you can get it up and running really quickly. And it's gonna build in all those steps for you. And then you can, of course, customize that as well. It's kind of interesting. I'm curious whether or not there might be more of these purpose-built type of solutions for continuous delivery in different domains.
There's definitely a lot more room for them to get traction. I would venture, at least it feels like, not as many companies have fully automated their machine learning and data pipelines as have their development pipelines. So whereas Proton faces a very entrenched solution at most enterprises and many small businesses, even in startups, here there's a lot of room. Companies are just getting into this, into SageMakers and machine learning. It feels like these could be the sleeper hits just because there's so little opposition to automating these pipelines. Here's a tool that solves this problem, and now you don't have to. Great, let's jump on it. Is that reasonable, do you think, to see them that way?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point that if you use it, it just kind of happens for you, right? And so if you don't have anything else in place already, and it gets you the feedback that you want, which is, what the data scientists are looking for. I mean, you think about the process that a data scientist has to usually go through for this, whether it's setting up the EC2 instances, maybe setting up the tests, configuring the endpoint, all those things. SageMaker itself has helped with that, but then being able to get this feedback, and they can just essentially click a button, get a pipeline to deliver this feedback for them. It's you think about the Amazon way, right? The Amazon way, forget AWS itself. Amazon way is about reducing friction. And so this is a way of reducing friction. And so, yeah, I think it's a really good point.
Excellent. We move on to fault injection simulator. And for this one, a part of me thinks about a similar aspect to Proton, where companies that have wanted this have already probably looked at Gremlin or some of the other tools that are out there, like Chaos Monkey from Netflix, and have built around that. And so we find ourselves in that same situation. Should we move to an AWS-oriented service, or do we hold back? This is great for companies that haven't made any investment in any of the chaos type engineering at all. Is that going to be the case where this one may fall by the wayside just because the companies that really wanted this have already built their whole solutions out?
I don't think so. I think that chaos engineering, despite the kind of the hype around it, is still really nascent. I mean, the difference between like a fault injection simulator and a chaos monkey or, the chaos of the Simian army is, that one's there's a really good reason, right? And that it's a fully managed service, right? You don't have to set up all those things. And so you don't have to do all the configuration. So that one's an easy one. When it comes to something like a Gremlin, that's a managed service. But I still think that it's still super early days when it comes to chaos engineering. I think most of the organizations that are applying that practice are mature in the cloud space, and they want to go to the next level and run these chaos experiments and ultimately get them into production. And so I think there's a huge opportunity comes to AWS getting in this space. And then the fact that then you get all the integrations. I would imagine once you have Fault Injection Simulator on AWS, and some of the ways that you might be able to incorporate things into your continuous delivery pipelines and things like that. And so yeah, in terms of how it works, they've shown some previews in some of the sessions so far, but you can't use anything yet. But the idea is that you have these experiment templates. They call them the experiments, chaos experiments, and then you can run these experiments based on these templates. And so they have examples that you can stop an instance. I give a list of all the different fault injection options. And so the one I talk about is the stop EC2 instance. And then they also have things like killing a process. They can run latency injections, terminate nodes, things like that. And, similar to the Simian Army in that way. The difference is now it's a fully managed service, and then the types of integrations that I imagine we'll be able to do when we have it will be great.
And this, though, for anybody who hasn't read the blog post, this is a service, though, they've announced it, and it's available sometime in later 2021. Is AWS getting too comfortable with services that are not ready for release? I remember it felt like, and maybe I just was not as experienced, but at my first reInvent in 2017, it seemed like most of the announcements were very ready to go. They were in preview. You could sign up for the preview, or they were just, this is the GA announcement. And that may, like I say, have been because I was still more green to the AWS announcements that were coming out, or that would have been 2015. Now it seems like at reInvent we see announcements that come out, and it takes them a whole year before they even get to the service. And I remember back in 2018, Outpost and Deep Racer both had announcements in 2018, but it was deep into 2019. I think for Deep Racer, it was around October when they finally shipped. It was, a big deal. Everybody kept getting delayed, and that made a lot of noise in Twitter. For Outpost, I think it made it all the way to the reInvent 2019, a year later, before they announced they were available. Should they be making announcements that far in advance, or should they be holding these a little bit closer to say, this is ready to go out the door?
Yeah, I don't know. You have to imagine that the reason that's done is for marketing reasons, or to, maybe let the industry know that this is going to be out there at some point. But with 145 announcemements, if they didn't announce Fault Injection Simulator, that'd be 144. Like, it's a little frustrating, I think, to see that, especially considering the fact that there are so many that are generally available, right, and ready to release. And so I don't know what the calculus is. I knew I would share it, but I think that maybe in some cases they talk about that so they can get people involved in a private beta, so they can get even more feedback. I think it's fine to do less than 145.
Absolutely. And plus all the pre-invent and post announcements as well. It's so much. I don't think anybody minds waiting a week or two where they make an announcement, reInvent, and it goes into a general preview that everybody could sign up for, or at least a limited preview where people sign up and you start hearing that it's being tested, and versus those long running where there tends to be a lot of noise. And I think Deep Racer was the worst because so many people wanted to have one of those to play around with it at home in a toyish way.
Yeah.
That one really seemed to bug people a lot, that it kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. If you weren't one of the lucky ones who attended a session at the reInvent in 2018, where you basically got handed one and trained on how to do development for it. We'll see what happens. That's always going to be the case, where they're always feeling a push to maintain their lead in the cloud and be, putting stuff out there that's ahead of everyone else.
Yeah.
I hope they don't move more and more into that process of announcements a year before the product's released.
Yeah.
After that, and this actually is one of my favorite announcements that I saw coming out of reInvent, which is the AWS CloudFormation modules. And it's because I've done a lot of work with Terraform modules, and I know how powerful they can be when you can have that ability to hand someone in this case, an AWS resource definition that handles 90% of their decision making for them, and they only have to provide the stuff that is unique to their application. And so I think all of these, CDK goes a similar way of allowing you to solve these problems for developers and make it simpler for them to define resources. Going back to your point, reducing the friction that people feel to use the product. And so modules, they make a big difference to me. I love seeing that approach finally make it into CloudFormation. What are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, it's another situation where you have a lot of options, right? And so it's important to understand, what makes this unique and different. So talk about you're able to do transforms in CloudFormation. You're able to write custom resources and define those and find those Lambda or macros. You can do it, similar types of things with CDK constructs and then resource providers, essentially creating your own resource. But again, you're writing Lambda code and functions and things like that for most of those. And so the difference with CloudFormation modules is that you're essentially using CloudFormation to create these extensions. You can write your own module, kind of freehand, if you will, but they recommend using the CloudFormation CLI. But the idea, as you said, is that you have basically these best practices, the way that you create these particular resources, this set of resources on your team. You do this in a certain way, you create it as a module. And then all the complexity associated with that for the developer, all they have to do is refer to that particular module, and then they know what properties and things like that, what toggles to turn on, and that sort of thing. And then there's a bunch of code essentially that goes away for them. And moreover, it's done the same way every single time. If you're always enabling encryption on your S3 bucket in this particular context, you're always sending a VPC in this manner, you can write a CloudFormation module for that, for your team, for your company, and then provide that. And I think, to your point, less friction, it's much easier to do that. You don't have to code up a Lambda function or whatever. And AWS has already provided several CloudFormation module examples that you can kind of look at how it gets generated from the CloudFormation CLI. And then you can look at, of course, the documents associated with that to generate your own. But, the one other thing is you can also publish it on the CloudFormation Registry as well. And so be able to consume that. And so I think it's much quicker for people to create this module and then moreover for people to use it.
Here's a question, if you'll indulge me in it, and I don't know if you're ready to take this one off the cuff. If you were launching a new startup tomorrow, building on AWS, out of Terraform, CloudFormation, CDK, now we even have the Terraform CDK and a couple other choices out there for managing infrastructure. Which direction would you lean to start for your infrastructure management?
CDK. I've read enough about Terraform, but I'm not a Terraform user. So I think coming from a developer background and, a lot of these, they're all solving a similar problem. Is you ultimately you're writing less code, but with CloudFormation modules, you're writing less code, but you're basically embedding these best practices. So it's done a certain way. And so with constructs, that's a way of doing that with the CDK. And so you look at the CDK examples, and you can write a VPC in basically a few lines. Whereas if you put that in a CloudFormation template, it goes on and on and on. Those are some of the biggest CloudFormation templates I ever see are the VPC templates. So that's what I would go with.
Yeah, that foundational network layer is always a monster.
Yeah.
I've heard that from others as well, of if you're a programmer, if you come from a dev background, CDK is a very natural way to define your infrastructure versus the operations people look more for declarative language. And that obviously is where that discussion starts at a company, is who's responsible for it, who's responsible for maintaining it and ensuring that it works, what testing. That's a huge discussion, but I really appreciate you at least kind of starting into it and where your mind is at on these tools, because there's so many and they each work slightly differently while still trying to accomplish the same goal. The next update that you talked about, and this is actually an enhancement, it's a feature on the Cloud Guru product instead of something totally brand new, but they added the security detector. And this is Cloud Guru took a lot of heat for their pricing model being around lines of code. A lot of people were concerned about that. Now we're seeing more features get added to it. Is this going to just be the way? Like, it doesn't matter how poorly it's priced. We need a tool that is absolutely focused on security and code quality, and we're willing to pay for that at all costs? Or does the pricing model get in the way on this one, even if it's got the best tooling out there?
Yeah. The pricing model is very different and unusual. So I will put the pricing model aside to talk about. So with Code Guru Security Detector, and there were some other features that were announced with Code Guru. They offer Python support now. It was originally just Java support when it was announced in 2019. They also have these code quality checks as well that they're embedding within it. But I mean, if you look at the capabilities are quite powerful in terms of, you're having a machine look for certain aspects that aren't up to the level when it comes to code quality or security issues. And so like from a security standpoint, it's looking at hard-coded credentials in your API calls or outdated cryptographic ciphers or insecure handling of any untrusted data. So like not sanitizing user input or things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, things like that. And so you're able to incorporate this into your code reviews. And now, in order to enable this, where you're selecting your repository, your source code repository, all you do now is basically there's a radio button that you select, and it includes those security recommendations as a part of that. So it's not just applying rules, it's applying machine learning to this. It's, again, looking at tens of thousands of Amazon teams and applying that knowledge to a code base. Again, it's just for Java and Python at this point, but my expectation, just with a lot of other services, that other programming languages will be supported.
There's a time where you do have to sit there and set aside the pricing model, where maybe it could be different, maybe it could be better. It is what it is. And that need, though, of having a tool that is paying attention to your source code and the ease of which you can just flick that on, and now you're getting additional feedback to your developers, outweighs the concern of how is it priced. Yeah. If your other option is to spend $100,000 up front to buy a solution, maybe it just doesn't matter at all. Yeah. That you're paying by the month, plus maintenance fees and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, they do have two different approaches that you can use. And one, you can run a full repository analysis, but you can also do just on a pull request. So only when you're making changes does it check the code associated with it. So I haven't thought through it enough to understand, like, there must be a reason for the cost. In terms of, ultimately, it comes down to compute and storage. So I'm curious what exactly is going on, like, to run that processing. And will there come a time where they're gonna start to reduce the price? You would imagine that they would.
Hopefully, yeah. As their engine gets more efficient, as it runs on lesser hardware, who knows? Maybe they can switch it over to the ARM systems.
Oh, right.
And instantly 50% cut in time, apparently, when you do that.
Right.
So who knows? But that would be good to see, just because I've heard that being a concern when people see that service. Mm-hmm. We move next to Amazon ECS, and specifically their announcement of adding a deployment circuit breaker functionality to the ECS deployments. And this is a very important change, because one of the biggest problems is, if something goes wrong, how quickly can you roll back to a point where everything is functional again? We see Amazon moving to automate that again. How much is this going to impact people who are on ECS and have made the decision to go with ECS versus Kubernetes or one of the cloud variants of it? Is this something that's going to push people to make a decision to say, I want to go to ECS instead of Kubernetes?
Well, I mean, I would imagine that this kind of feature that might be provided with EKS as well at some point. I'm just guessing, but yeah, the whole idea of the circuit breaker that comes from Michael Nygaard's work, where he talked about it and release it, where you have basically, it's looking for, your software is looking for a certain number of failures, and then it trips that circuit breaker once it goes over whatever threshold that you've set for it. And so ECS has made this super simple. It's just basically a Boolean that you turn on, whether or not you want this capability, whether or not you want to trip it. And then it also allows you one other Boolean to roll back those changes if necessary. And the really cool thing about it is that it also runs, you can run it in CloudFormation. It's a new property in the ECS service resource, and you can run in the CLI and stuff like that. But it runs at essentially the ECS orchestration level, or the scheduler. And so what that means is, whether or not you're using the console or even Terraform SDK, it's running essentially through the API. And so when you enable it, it's going to run no matter what it is that you're using. And so AWS determines when that circuit breaker gets tripped based on the size of your deployment. And if you think about how does this work, if you haven't written your own custom code around this, I've experienced this, and I've tried to deploy an ECS service, it just will churn and churn and churn, right? In some cases, it might take hours before it finally just, or based on the timeout or whatever, it just gives up, right? And so with this, you're going to find out much more quickly with it. It's really easy to get up and running. And so you can get rid of any of the kind of custom logic that you may have implemented for that. And it might take some time to do this. It might be something you do for new services at first, like we were talking about. But yeah, provide an example of how you might do this in CloudFormation, but really straightforward. It's just a property, or it's a complex type, and within that type you can enable it and you can roll it back, and you set those to true or false appropriately. There's no additional costs for the feature. By the way, in all the services, I talk about patterns that you might use to how you might incorporate this into a deployment pipeline, right? And so this one's no different, where I talk about, you might use a CloudFormation deployed provider if you're using CodePipeline. If you're using something else, then you would kind of adjust accordingly. But the same idea is that you might be launching a CloudFormation stack, you might be running a change set or whatever, and then you can apply these changes appropriately. But there's really not much to do when it comes to enabling this feature. So it's really easy and quick to get up and running.
And I have seen people spend months of time, across several people, when you add up all the time they're spent on it, just focusing in on this challenge and building step functions around it, or manual solutions, some way to pay attention to a deployment while it's going on, monitor it, and then come back. So this is, again, a way just to save that effort that you're having to do, so you can focus in on what's generating that value, making it easier for us to focus in on what matters to us most and ignore a lot of those other places just because there's somebody else managing them, which is, that was what you talked about at the beginning of the blog post, is that goal of we don't have to think about these things anymore. The network firewall then continues that, because again, we have something that previously we've had to think a lot about. Companies agonize over their network firewall rules. The amount of time spent determining what the rules should be, what software to choose, what the process is wrapped around that for making changes. Network firewall opens the door to now treating our entire firewall and configuration as basically infrastructure as code. And so we see another place where we're not having to focus in on the manual process. We're able to automate this all away. And I think that's a huge win for companies, just to be able to do that and be able to have a better process there. What are your thoughts? Like how soon are we going to see this one take off?
Yeah, so this is another, of course, fully managed service that AWS is providing. And the other thing that I'm seeing as well is, if you look at Firewall Manager as an example, there's some other ones as well where they're starting to codify things across multiple resources and applying similar patterns. So in this case, you're defining your network firewall against multiple VPCs, right? And so Firewall Manager, as an example, is applying, your firewall, say, security groups. You can set it up to run across your organization. But the idea, though, is AWS is giving you options to standardize how you operate across multiple resources within your AWS ecosystem. And so in the case of network firewall, you don't have to stand up. You don't have to stand up the instances associated with that. So it's providing high availability, scalability with that. And as you talked about, it's now your network firewall is code. And they've actually, again, once again, they've provided CloudFormation support for this. And so you can set up your firewall, the firewall itself. You can set up the policy associated with that firewall. You can set up logging configuration. You can set up any kind of rules that you want to apply across your VPCs. And so you can do that within your network firewall. And so it's again, once again, it's kind of lessening the friction associated with applying these services in a consistent manner, so that you're not, depending on the account, depending on the region, depending on whatever, you're not having to do essentially the same thing over and over again. You're able to codify it and apply it across multiple resources.
On that idea, and codifying it and saying, here's what it should be. Have you had experience where the effort of trying to describe what something should be is far more difficult than just writing the code that actually is the implementation of? And in infrastructure, it's, I think back to the operations side of a developer sitting there and trying to describe the infrastructure they need versus a developer writing CloudFormation or CDK or Terraform that is actually the definition and will be used in the creation. How much time can companies save just by moving to that directly codified way of this is the change I need, and evaluate it, versus trying to describe the change and then hope that somebody understands it correctly?
Yeah, exactly. It's unambiguous. right? The definition of your infrastructure is in code. That becomes the language that all the teams start to use, especially if you have a strategy in place in your company to say, this is ultimately the only way we're going to communicate. Everything, whether it's from analysts to data scientists to security engineers to developers to QA, this is the language we're going to use. And when I say language, I just mean code. We're going to define this stuff in code because it makes it unambiguous. And if there's something that needs to be fixed, we go to one, source of truth, one place, make that change. And that change is ultimately going to apply to all those constituents, all those roles in an organization.
I think that over time is such an impactful change at the organization to see that happen. The last service out of the list, and thank you for taking so much time to chat with me about this, the blog post and the Reinvent announcements that are impacting developers and their processes, is the app registry for Service Catalog. And this one, I have not seen that much Service Catalog implementation. At a conceptual level, I love the idea of saying, here is a template and you can just launch it as many times as you need and provide the 3 or 4 separate ways. I haven't seen it used in many places. What's your experience with Service Catalog and the new feature like this being added and seeing it actually get adopted? Are you seeing a lot of that?
Yeah, I think it's also something that's pretty familiar with enterprises that have been around for a while, and they want a way to apply the governance, but do it in a way that's flexible, that gives them the ability to change. And so, I think with one of the challenges with Service Catalog has been whether Service Catalog actually, whether it's CloudFormation, whatever, is there are a lot of resources out there, and you kind of no longer understand the context around it. So you can use tags, but tags only basically give you a name value pair way of identifying. And so you ultimately need something more complex than just a name value pair. And so this allows you to, right now it supports CloudFormation stacks, but this allows you to link resources like your pipelines, your environments, to your CloudFormation stacks. And one of the ways that you might be able to use this, like from a security perspective, and that would determine which applications are using a certain version or certain tools associated with that. Because with App Registry, you have more of these complex types. It's not just, like I said, it's not just the name or the key value pair. So you're able to define this application is associated with, these CloudFormation stacks and these, which might include these environments and these pipelines. You're able to put all the resources together for a particular service or application and define it as such. And so you can start to think about ways that you can apply changes in a similar manner. Or, from an audit perspective, be able to look at certain applications and identify maybe patches or things like that. And you might come up with an automation scheme around that to apply those patches in a consistent way across what you see, how you've logically defined this as an application or a service. And so I think that, as I mentioned earlier, you can use App Registry without using Service Catalog. And so, for the companies that you're talking about that haven't used Service Catalog, you could still use a feature like this. But I've seen Service Catalog work really well in organizations that have hundreds, thousands of different teams, and they have, a large AWS footprint, and they want to make sense of that and do it in a way where they have that governance around the process.
Yeah, that is a large problem space of just keeping track of your entire deployment and knowing what's out there. And seeing an option that does it without having to use Service Catalog, being able to get value out of the App Registry that can bring all that together and give that view, can really help understand what's out there. Kind of from a visibility aspect, I wonder if this is kind of along the lines of the cost allocation tags, where you just being able to tag them so you can see your billing from the aspect of which applications are costing me more money. This is that same type of a thing, just more from a resource standpoint of just being able to isolate all of these to be able to understand this is part of application A, this is part of application B, and seeing that is tremendous.
Well, that's another use case, right? With App Registry is being able to, whether or not you're interfacing with cost allocation, but because you have this complex way of, and you have this repository of applications and their associated resources, you could figure out the costs associated with that, which is huge, right? That's basically, you don't see many organizations doing that right now. If you're able to do that, so that's just, those are just two, the security use case and the cost management use case. Those are just two use cases of being able to make sense out of the context that's provided from this.
Very cool. Well, thank you for taking the time to do such a deep dive with the blog post, but then also to come on the podcast and talk about that blog post. As we started off the discussion, there are code samples with this of how to implement this in, how to add this to your CloudFormation stacks for everything that's at least in preview far enough to have that support. There's the CLI commands to be able to generate this information. This blog post shows the value of taking a long look at what came out of Reinvent versus just that immediate instant take of, oh, this would be useful for this would be useful for this. No, here's actually how to implement these. And I think that's going to be really valuable for everyone who reads it to understand and be able to have that instant way to apply what they've learned and implement it in their architecture. So thank you for that. Hopefully in 11 months time, we're all stepping foot in Las Vegas. What's the first thing you're going to do when you land?
There's certain people that I only see at Reinvent, right? And so it would probably be meeting up with people like that as soon as I got there.
Yeah, I am sure a lot of people will be doing the same. I know I will probably be one of the first people in line for the Sunday night kickoff, the Monday Madness, just to be there to kick it off and hang out with everyone that, people that I've never met and probably will never meet again, but just to have fun chatting and get that social side out. Well, hopefully we'll find time to catch up while we're there. And thank you for taking the time to chat with us and walk us through all these features in such great detail. I really appreciate it, Paul.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Paul. It was a pleasure to sit down with him and hear his thoughts now that he'd had so much time to look back on Reinvent. It definitely changes the perspective when you take that time afterwards and look back at the services and the announcements that were made. That wraps up the 29th episode of DevOps on AWS Radio. Thank you for joining me as we continue our effort to improve the software delivery process through DevOps on AWS.
Thanks for listening. For the latest from Stelligent on AWS DevOps and being a remote-first company, see stelligent.com/blog.